Hi, Jenny.
Hi, Lori.
Welcome to another wonderful adventure of making videos together. Today, we're making a video about the upcoming Mars retrograde. This is a really important one, I think, to discuss, so we've decided to do just that. But as an introduction, if you're new here, Jenny is Jenny Date of Hidden Path Astrology. Find her at hiddenpathastrology.com. You can find me at lauriefarrington.com. And all the information you need about us and all the things that we do, you'll find below in the show notes. Before I move any further, I want to plug my book, which is How to Read and Interpret a Birth Chart, guideposts for natal astrology, something like that. You can pre-order that book anytime now on Amazon or on Barnes and Noble. The release date, it's being released by Wiser Books. It'll be released on January 9th, I believe. And this is a book that is dedicated to helping people who know a certain amount of astrology, helping them to really understand how to work with a natal chart. So get on board, get that book ordered. It'll help you understand natal charts a lot.
Mhm.
So what do you have to talk about, Jenny?
Well, I pre-ordered my copy of your book, so I'm very
Yay!
excited about that. I know it's going to be really good, so I'm very excited. Yeah, I have a few classes that I'm offering. I have my in-person class workshop schedule up on my website. I'm teaching a whole bunch of different things on 2025 and just a few different little pieces about astrology. So check that out. And, if you live in the area, come and sign up for one of those. I'm also putting together my online workshop schedule, which will be out soon, so that if you live far away, you can also join me for stuff. So that's kind of the gist of it. I'm really excited to be teaching. I'm also available for just like Lori for consultations and also mentoring, so which is very exciting. Um, that's it. I think I've covered my bases, so let's carry on.
All right. So what we are here to talk about is the Mars retrograde. And I think the first thing we had decided we wanted to share with you is just the dates. There are the specific dates for when Mars is actually retrograde. Mars stations retrograde on December 6th and stations direct on February 23rd. However, there is the whole shadow period. And that is the time where Mars goes into the area that it will backtrack to. So there's this whole longer cycle, this whole longer piece lasts from October 5th, which we're long past now. But that was when Mars initially entered its shadow on October 5th. Again, it's stationed retrograde December 6th. It will station direct on February 23rd, and it will exit its shadow on May 2nd. So the long piece of the retrograde lasts from early October to early May. It's a long period of time.
Yeah, it sure is.
And yeah, everything that happens within that period of time that involves Mars or the areas of your chart where this retrograde is happening is going to be really, really impacted by this retrograde. And the other thing that we're going to talk about, and I'm going to let Jenny really handle this one, is the whole cycle of Mars, which is really getting getting more specific about the whole piece of what this is a part of.
Yeah. And so before we kind of dazzle your eyes with a bunch of numbers and things, let's just talk about the meaning of what Mars retrograde means. So as Lori said, yeah, the actual moment in time when it's retrograde is 2.5 months. The whole cycle, or sorry, not the whole cycle, but the whole period with the shadow it's like 7 months. So one of the things we were talking about as we were getting ready for this video is like, this is a process. This is not something that's quick. And I think that's a great jumping off point because if Mars wants anything, it wants it to be quick.
Mhm.
So to have a Mars retrograde period is really countercultural for Mars because Mars in your chart, or Mars in mundane astrology, is whizzing around out there in space. It represents action. It represents forward movement. It represents like I'm going to do this thing and I'm going to do it now and here's how it's going to go and boom, and it moves on. So it's very, very rapid. I think You can think about Mars in your natal chart as representing a place where you have a lot of energy to move things forwards. You might also have anger there, like those
Mm.
heated kind of, it's got a real outward expressive piece to it. And so to have it retrograde is like it just is not where it wants to go. And part of what we see with a retrograde cycle is that it's rather a shock. I mean, even though you're like, oh, I know it's going to retrograde, it's still a shock because it seems like everything's moving forwards and going quickly. And then all of a sudden, you just have this about face and it's pretty uncomfortable. So, Laurie, what do you want to say about Mars retrograde in general?
Well, I think a lot, what you said about it being a process
Mhm.
and a long process. We cannot, what was it? You just think about it. You think something, and you can probably look at your life right now and see something that you thought you were going to just move ahead with. And all of a sudden, you're starting to realize as we're getting closer and closer to the actual retrograde, you're starting to realize, oh dear, this isn't a quick process. And case in point, I have to say, is the surgery that I went through. I thought, oh yeah, I'm going to get this surgery, and within a few months, I'm going to be hiking again. Like everything's going to just move forward quickly. Well, it's starting to dawn on me that this is a long, slow full-time job. And I think that really because like you said, Mars just wants to take action, it just wants to move forward. And when it suddenly comes into all kinds of restrictions and no, you're not going to go forward, you're actually going to stop and go backwards before you go forward. Yeah, it's a shock, and it's something that we have to kind of lean into. We have to lean into. And, I think Mars retrograde is probably experienced very differently for people who have Mars retrograde in their own charts. That's probably a whole different conversation. But you do want to be aware of that. If Mars is retrograde in your chart, watch how your process with it may be different. In your own life, you probably don't have that expectation of things moving fast as much as the rest of us might also.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up the natal Mars retrograde thing because it is definitely something that I know you and I both look for in a chart and along with some other planets too. But I think it's worth just having a quick mention of like, what is it like to have Mars retrograde in the natal chart, especially because you and I are both natal astrologers. But I have a few sort of key words for that. And one of my big ones is maverick. And I say that
Mhm.
because it really it's a when you have Mars retrograde in your natal chart, it really suggests someone that's like, it's countercultural. It takes that extroverted, quote unquote, masculine energy and it turns it on its head. It
Yeah.
subverts that energy. And it really speaks to someone who has to really go within in order to understand how to go without. So Mars is normally very extroverted. And when you have it as a more of an introverted, countercultural figure in your chart, it's just a totally different situation. And there's a process of internalization of managing your own deep inner, world and factors in order for you to find your way forwards. It is not an easy placement.
Mhm.
What are some of the things you think about with a,
Well, I think, yeah, just Maverick, just anyone who has, I think of any of the, Mercury retrograde, Venus retrograde, Mars retrograde in the natal chart just speaks to a person who uses that energy in a way that is outside the cultural norms, the cultural expectations. And with Mars, it would be, yeah, taking action. It could also involve issues around your sexual energy, how you use your sexual energy. So think about that, and make sure you know if Mars is retrograde in your chart.
yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes it's not obvious. If you just look at your chart and you don't see that little RX next to it, you might think, oh, you're in the clear with that. But, if you look at an ephemeris and see that Mars just went direct 2 days before you were born, or just went retrograde 2 days after you were born, you're caught up in it as well. So
Nice.
it's good to, if you don't know how to get that information yourself, when or if you talk to an astrologer, those are questions you might want to ask.
Yeah, and that's awesome because when I was preparing for this video, I was thinking there's, natal Mars retrograde, and then what you're talking about is the progressed Mars retrograde. That's another variation, another way to see how this type of internalized energy plays out in your life. And today we're mostly talking about transiting Mars retrograde in the mundane world of astrology, but nonetheless, it has an effect and an impact on all of us.
Yeah.
So I like there's these different layers and ways that you can look at that that type of energy. So, let's see. So, I don't know. So, as far as like Mars retrograde in the mundane thing, I guess what we should really talk about is the fact that Mars is in Cancer and then it moves into Leo and it retrogrades in Leo. So it goes back through part of Leo for a bit and then it goes back into Cancer and it remains, it continues going backwards through Cancer until it reaches 17 degrees Cancer where it stations direct. So what is really interesting to the two of us, or part of it is that because it's in Leo and Cancer, it makes it a much more personal retrograde process for all of us. And the reason is because of that geeky astrology thing called rulerships. And rulerships refer to a planet being in charge of a sign. And the sun and the moon are in charge of Leo and Cancer. And so that brings this Mars retrograde process into a much more personal sphere for each of us because it really refers to these places that are tightly connected to our personal self-expression, our core self, represented by the sun, and then your moon, which is your driving emotional need, your inner emotional nature, your past, your reactivity, your emotional vulnerability, all tied into that. So to have a Mars retrograde contacting all of that, it really brings this very personal process to each of us. So I think that makes this one rather unique.
Yeah, absolutely. It does.
Mhm.
So, do you want to talk about the full cycle?
Yes, I think is there anything you want to add about the signs at this
I
point
don't
or?
I don't think so. I think,
Yeah.
you're going to really the day that Mars re-enters Cancer, which is January 6th, there's really going to be, I think, a very palpable change in how you have that sense of frustration around your energy. When Mars is retrograding in Leo, going back through those early degrees of Leo, it's going to be, it's going to be a very physical almost sense of frustration. And then
Mhm.
on January 6th, when it re-enters Cancer, it's going to be more of an emotional, you're going to start having the emotional response to that physical frustration. Oh my
Mm.
goodness, that almost makes me cry
Yeah.
to think about it. I'm definitely in the physical frustration right now. I don't
Yeah.
necessarily look forward to the emotional frustration. But yeah, there's going to be a real shift there, and you're going to really want to notice that.
Yeah.
So I think that's what I want to say about that.
Okay. Yeah, no, and I just want to add one last little flourish to this piece, and then let's look at some dizzying numbers. But the flourishing piece is just, think about this. Mars is in a water sign, goes into a fire sign, stops in the fire sign, goes backwards into the water sign. So water, feelings, emotions, swimming, like less tangible things that you're managing. And fire is just like the heat of expression. All it wants to do is burn outwards and shine a light, and it can't. It's going to be asked to kind of withdraw and shine an internal light. So just think about that transfer from feelings to the more fire expressive piece, and then back to feelings, and then back to the expression. So that's kind of a little theme here.
Yeah.
I'm trying to make you cry.
You
Um,
could do it easily these days.
yeah. Um, well, let's dizzy your minds with some numbers here or dates.
Dates, yes.
Okay.
Okay. So what you want to talk about is really the full Mars cycle, right?
Yeah, let's pop that first
Okay.
slide.
Okay, I'll pop that slide open here. Whoops. Excuse me while I learn how to use my computer. Here we go.
Okay. There's a lot on the slide, so let's just start
Hey,
with the top.
yeah, and you might want to take a screenshot of this.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's a good idea because there's a lot on here. So the beginning is just what Laurie has already, said to you. The shadow period, the actual retrograde on December 6th in Leo, the station direct on February 23rd, and then done with the shadow. So this right here is your 7 month cycle. So that's why it's a process. Like, good Lord. Okay. Um,
Oh, good
the
Lord.
second
That's
chunk
all
of things, just scribble on it. The second lot here, the Mars conjunct the Sun, that it starts with, this is the whole cycle. So the entire cycle is 2 years, 2 months. And it started way back in November 18th, 2023. Mars conjuncted the Sun, it was back in Scorpio last year. And then they didn't really bother a whole bunch with each other. I mean, there's, less pertinent aspects, but the one that really next catches our eye is the Mars square the Sun on October 14th. So that on that time it was the Sun was in Libra, Mars was in Cancer, it was a square. So there's some tension building during that square. That's kind of like some I don't know, some frustration. I mean, I certainly, when I think about myself at this time, I think about some of my anxiety around the US election, just as an example. And also some personal stuff. There was some anxiety around something to do with my elderly parents. So just as a personal note.
That was 2 days before my surgery.
Oh shit. Okay, there's your whoa. All right. So that's a good illustration of like, okay, you're getting ready for this intense thing. And then what we have next is Mars trine Sun. And again, this is the Sun is back in Scorpio and Mars is still in Cancer. So at this point, it almost feels like, oh, okay, we're good, right? Like it's a trine, it's a nice aspect, everything's moving forwards. But it's not really so, because although it's a trine, it's the first cue that we're heading into a retrograde period because the Sun and Mars always trine before it's going into a retrograde period. So although it's like this kind of this excitement, it's also like it's kind of heralding this slowdown because Mars is also slowing down in this period, which is it's starting to get ready for that retrograde. So that's a big cue.
So that
Um,
trine is sort of an illusion.
Yes, yes. It kind of it's a little deceptive.
Yeah, interesting.
It's because you're thinking like, oh, it's great. There's this flow. They're gonna, just charge each other up, and yeah, and it is charging up, but it's charging up for a slowdown and a stop.
Yeah.
So that's the shocker. So then it, retrogrades December 6th there. And then the midpoint of the cycle, you have Mars opposing the Sun on January 15th. Yeah, what do you think about the opposition to the Sun? Do you have any
That's yeah, I think of that as the optimum point of frustration in the whole cycle.
Yeah, I think because what's happening is from that trine moment to the opposition, yeah, everything's starting. What happens is the external reverses direction and things start to become internalized. And you may even feel, reactive or even like sort of depressed, like the doldrums, like, oh, I don't know what's happening. And it kind of, ugh, and so you hit that opposition, which just as you said is that maximum like, oh, good Lord, here we are. But it's also the release point. It's the beginning of the switch in energy. So the whole first half of the cycle is this kind of building and and then you hit that midpoint and it's like, okay,
And
we're
it's
in.
also, that's like a week after Mars re-entered Cancer.
Yeah.
So part of the frustration is that process of shifting from it being an outward frustration to an inner emotional frustration.
Yeah.
Huh,
Totally. That's a really good point.
interesting.
Yeah. So, this is that's because the sun will be in Capricorn then, and then Mars is in Cancer. So yeah, you're very much dealing with the yin and the yin of that. Like Capricorn sun is like, I want to get things done, like progress, let's go. And Mars is like, oh no, no. You need to kind of really go within to the deeper level here. Um, and then, it continues going backwards, and then it stations direct on February 23rd. And after that station, you have the second trine, the Mars sign trine, trine the Sun.
Mm.
So at that point, and what's interesting here is then they'll be in fire signs. Mars will be in Leo and the Sun will be in Aries. So the second trine, I do feel like has a lot more energy to it. The first one was,
Good.
yeah, I mean,
Good.
this,
It'll be springtime too here in the northern hemisphere.
yeah, and I think this is when you really start to get clear about what the process was about. You start to realize that you have new strategies, that you've, relinquished something that you're not passionate about anymore. You've let it go because it's just not going to
Wow.
work. So you kind of have this refresh, renewal, like new strategies and new ability for diplomacy in how
Mm,
you navigate with the external world at this point. So that, and then you have Mars square the sun. That's your crisis point. Now you're going to have to act on whatever it is that you learned and,
mm,
whatever's going on at this time. So that's kind of a big, and at that point, the sun will be in Taurus. So you're going to have to start grounding your new plan or your new set of motivations into something. And then and then they don't really tangle again until way until January 10th, 2026. So it's a kind of a funny cycle where you have all this activity all at once in this kind of conjunct, this period of time between
yeah.
October, April. So that's the bigger context.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
awesome. I'm so glad that we covered that because that's a really important piece. And for an awful lot of you listening, you probably skipped it.
And that's
But
fine. But I was
and
gonna
that's
give you
fine, yeah. But if you have listened to it, you've probably learned something because this is very important, I think.
yeah. And then this last piece we have on this slide is, all of the context it makes in its trine, I mean, sorry, in its Mars retrograde. There's a trine to Saturn. The big one is the opposition to Pluto. The first one of that, November 3rd, right before the US election. So we've already gone through that. And then it has a sextile to Uranus and a trine to Neptune. So, I mean, Laurie, what do you think about this? Like,
Well, that's
these pretty positive aspects.
it's totally fascinating that the aspects that Mars makes during this retrograde period are all to the outer planets. Well, there's Saturn, but that one starts earlier.
Mhm.
Yeah, and even that, Saturn is not a personal planet. So Mars really is interacting on this very this very big cultural manner.
Yeah.
This, as personal as this impacts us, and it certainly does, we look at this and we know that the bigger story is a cultural story. It's
Yeah.
also, like you said, Mars opposed Pluto was like 2 days before the election. And then the next Mars opposed Pluto, which that is the most significant of the aspects, January 3rd. That's a few days before the inauguration. These are really tied in. And then Mars entering Cancer on January 6th, a few days before the inauguration. It's so tied in to the world stage here.
Yeah. And it's funny because when I look at these and it's a trine to Saturn, a sextile to Uranus, a trine to Neptune, those three aspects are flowing aspects and represent opportunities and gifts. And from those series of things, I really feel like as difficult as things are right now, that this is for the greater good, like the way that things are going to shift. Now, I don't know how big that scale is because we're human beings. We only live for 80 whatever years on average, right? So that scale might be way longer than a human lifetime. I'm not really sure, but what I do know is it's a very interesting time, if scary, if intense, but it is an interesting time to be alive and to be curious about
Yeah.
these longer processes and cycles. And that's part of the reason I do astrology for sure, is just to have that look. So I feel it's just interesting to see that. I am not I'm definitely clear that there's a lot of intensity, especially the Leo to Cancer thing. There's a lot going on here. There's a lot about the way we wield our masculine energy as individuals and as a culture. There's so much going on in this election to do with repression of rights and to do with the feminine and to do with the cultural interplay between masculine and feminine, or male and female, dare I say, and the way that we use energy, the way that we use all of the earth energy that's intrinsic to our planet. These are all things that are in question, and this Mars retrograde is really bringing a lot of these things really into a tight focus right now. It's a very
Yeah.
tight focus on
Yeah,
that.
you think about Mars as around sexuality and the whole masculine feminine polarity involved here. And it is fascinating. We really, I think during this Mars retrograde, there's going to be so much focus on these issues. And on a personal level, we all have to really relook at how we wield power, how we understand those, male, female, masculine, feminine, however you envision that. Um, it's definitely on the table in all kinds of ways. And all of these aspects wrap up in April. What? Well, that's really interesting. And two of them are exact on the same day. What do you think of
Yeah.
April?
Wow, April's a super interesting month. I actually have been spending a lot of time recently looking at April in my consultations and stuff because not only do you have these things going on, this wrap up of this Mars retrograde period, but you also
Oh,
have before that, you're going to have a wrap up of a Mercury retrograde period, a wrap up of a Venus retrograde period, both happening towards the end of the Pisces season, and like so, which is obviously earlier than this. But just that whole, and then you come into, just what is going on in April. There's a lot happening. It's the beginning of the eclipse cycle. There's a couple of eclipses at the very end of March that are
and
also, yeah, there's a
the whole
lot.
springtime, all of the outer planets change signs in the spring.
Yeah.
So does
Yep.
Saturn and Jupiter.
Mhm.
There's so much happening.
Yep. And I mean, Mars, just so you know, for those of you listening, like Mars is a trigger planet. I always think of Mars as the trigger. It's so a lot of times you'll see bigger things happening and Mars, boom, comes along and it escalates it. And I will just say, back in 2020, we did have Mars retrograde in Aries, and it was a trigger point for all the COVID stuff. It looked like things are settling down, and boom, things kick back up. So just as a cultural example of a few years ago. So yeah, just wow. I just think this April is going to be a very, very interesting time.
It is.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All
Okay.
right. Well, I think we've covered a lot here.
Yeah.
Let me see here for 1 second. I'm going to pause this recording for a moment. I want to pause it without stopping it. And that's tricky. I don't know if is it still recording?
It sure is.
It is. Huh. I can't
I
seem
think
to.
it's not anymore. Oh, nope, it still is.
It still is. Oh, I just do not want to stop it because it makes it. Um, hmm. Pause recording.
Okay.
All right, we are back with you. Sorry for that little momentary delay. We're going to go now and just take a real quick look at the chart of when Mars retrogrades. So
Okay.
here, this is a chart for December 6th, 2024 at 6:33 p.m. And we wanted to just take a quick look at those aspects that are made
Mhm.
during this time.
Yeah.
Uh, let's see.
Well, should we do it in order? Like, because the first one would be the one to
Yeah.
Saturn. And we could just,
Yeah, and that first one is a trine, right? A trine
yeah,
from,
yeah. So we have a trine from Mars to Saturn. Um, that's when Mars was in Cancer. So don't get thrown by that. But
right.
when Mars is in Cancer, it trined Saturn, and it's going to trine it 3 times in this process: September 30th, February 9th, April 4th. And because you took a screenshot of the other one, you've got this. So that's the first piece is the Saturn. I think this kind of adds a stability to things. And it adds, I guess what I would say is when Mars is in Cancer, it was having us look at, how we do our own self-care, how we take care of our emotional beings and our emotional being and wellness. And the trine to Saturn to me makes a statement about, and you've got to think about the collective. You've got to think about how you cultivate empathy, how you cultivate compassion. So you're doing self-care, Mars and Cancer, but part of the purpose and part of the support for that is because when you're doing that, you can better take care of people around you. You can better support people in your life. You can add more stability, you can add more structure. And it's because you're understanding that people are suffering and that you're really working to be available. That's how I interpret it. Do you have keywords for that?
No, I think that's great. And I think one of the ways that it's useful for us to be opening up the actual chart here is for you to see that that trine is from Saturn in Pisces to Mars when it was in Cancer. So you can look at your own chart and you can look for where Pisces is in your chart and see where that stability is coming from, where you're being supported in that way.
Yeah, cool.
So I think that's all I feel we need to say on that. The next aspect is Mars opposing Pluto, right?
That's one of them. Yep.
Was there?
Yeah, no, let's talk about this one. This is the oh God. So this is the one that happened on November 3rd, right before the election, and I distinctly remember writing about something unsettling or shocking coming to light. The second one when Mars is retrograde. So wait, sorry, first one was when it was in Cancer. Mars is in Cancer, Pluto was in Capricorn. Pluto then moved into Aquarius, November 19th, and then on January 3rd, Mars opposes Pluto, and again, and yes, that one's the Leo to Aquarius. And then the final one is April 26th. You have this opposition. I think this is the
Yeah,
trickiest, most
yeah,
volatile one. Yeah, it really is that rip, the veneer's being ripped off. You're now looking into the abyss. You're looking into the truth. You're looking into, if you want to get graphic, it's like you have a wound that healed wrong and you've had to and get back into it and clear it out. It's raw.
Oh
It's
no.
raw and it's gnarly, but I think that's a good way to think about it because my positive thing about this is you can't heal the wound until you go
Right.
in and clear it
Right.
out. And
Yeah.
this clears it out.
Yes.
So that,
And it's interesting that first one when Pluto was still in Capricorn and Mars was in Cancer. By the time we get to the second one, where Pluto is in Aquarius, it's not going back. It's finally made its final pass into Aquarius. So this is the first time Mars has interacted with Pluto in its new position. It's
yeah.
gonna yeah, it's interesting. It's very interesting.
Yeah, because it really, you can't help but think about the Cancer Capricorn polarity is a yin sign. It's more internal. You can almost think about this for simplicity's sake, as the mother and father. That's a simple way to think about Capricorn and Cancer, like that kind of governing energy, but it's inward. There's an inward piece to it, and then now we're in Leo and Aquarius. Way more extroverted. Now we're in a yang sign, and I keep thinking about Pluto and Aquarius just on a very simple, quick level, it's technology and humanitarianism. And how do those play
And
out?
there's, I always think, and there's something very potentially perverse about Aquarius.
Mm-hmm.
And with Mars in Leo in this egotistical sign and that perversity that Aquarius can bring into the equation. And yeah, all the technology, the power of technology and how it can be misused. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't want to get all, well, we don't get political too much, just because it's a different form of astrology. It's not, it's certainly worthwhile talking about. And I'm glad there are astrologers out there doing that because it's super necessary. But quick note, Trump has a lot of Leo energy. He's got Mars and Leo. So
Yeah.
it's just interesting to contemplate that.
Yeah.
Um, and that one because it's January 3rd, and as things come out, as the news continues to unfold, it's we're definitely looking at some warlike and scary components to that. So, there you go. But then it's like you come all the way through in April 26th, you have the final one. Yeah, I'm very curious. I don't know it's easy to kind of make significations about the first two because of what they line up with in the US election. But I don't know as much about that April 26th. But also in your own personal life, thinking about where this plays out, because Pluto has made his grand entrance now into some part of your life, and
Yeah.
Mars is going to make sure that you know about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. Definitely. Yeah. Go back and listen to our videos about Pluto moving into Aquarius. I wrote a big piece on Patreon and Substack about it recently. That's worth reading.
Yeah, it is worth reading. I read it and it's
Did
been,
you?
yeah, I
Thanks.
did. Forgot to tell you
Cool.
that.
Yeah.
So yeah, read Lori's thing. Really good. And then the last two pieces here that we just quicker mention, because Pluto is the big one, is Mars sextiles Uranus, October 24th, January 23rd, and April 4th. So two of those are when Uranus is still in Taurus, and the last one is actually, I'm not totally positive about that. I think I might be lying. Anyway, the sextile to Uranus, what does that say to you, Lori? That's like an
Well,
opportunity.
yeah, I mean, sextiles are opportunities. They're possibilities. They're things that we need to engage. They aren't going to happen automatically, I think. But Uranus and Mars certainly speaks to sudden actions being taken, unexpected actions being taken, and the results of them. Uh, that's pretty interesting. I noticed that I've said it's pretty interesting about 300 times.
So, uh, and I did just want to correct myself. Both of this will always be when Mars is in Cancer. All three of those hits, Mars in Cancer, Uranus still in Taurus. So those are more yin, the opportunity of the yin component. So this is, some possibility of stabilizing yourself, like taking advantage of what might help stabilize you in communities is kind of, what I would think, in short. So, um, and the last one is the trine to Neptune. So, and this one will be, just double checking my notes here. The first two are water signs. So again, Cancer to Pisces. And then the last one is going to be Leo, Mars and Leo, and Neptune newly in Aries. Big shift. So that's very different. The first two, that's much more inward, ethereal. I don't know, like, again, really leaning into maybe your spirituality, your sense of the collective, your imaginative components, like things like art, can be very, very helpful and cathartic in this time, all different sorts of art. But then, wow, when we get into the fire version of that,
Yeah.
ooh, that's going to be interesting. That's a pretty
Yeah.
different.
Neptune moving into Aries is going to be, well, we'll make a video of it, but
Sure
it'll
shall.
be a different world.
Yeah.
We are definitely heading into a different world. And I think this Mars retrograde is part of the push.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I think that's done. I think we've done it.
I think we've done it for sure. If anyone listens to all of this, that's
Well
awesome.
done.
Okay, so we want to move now into talking about how this is going to impact us on an individual level.
Mhm.
I think we're going to just kind of, riff back and forth between the two of us on what we see here. So we're going to
Yeah.
start with folks who have Aries rising. If
Mhm.
you've got Aries rising, this retrograde happens in your fifth and fourth house. So the retrograde itself, when Mars goes retrograde, it is in your fifth house. It slows down and comes to a stop and retrogrades in Leo in your fifth house. You know, this is really about, like we talked earlier, this is a very personal thing because it's in Leo and Cancer, ruled by your sun and your moon. There's something here about you might have really felt like things are moving forward. You've got some new idea about some creative project. There's something just, Mars loves to be in Leo. Generally speaking, Mars is very happy in Leo and it's going to take dramatic action and move forward. But there's that, okay, you thought that was what was happening, but you got to slow down and back up and really look at what's your motivation for this movement forward. And as it goes back into Cancer, you're really looking at what emotional components you left behind in your anticipation of blasting forward with your creativity or love affairs or whatever it is with that fifth house. But there's real internal, deep emotional work that you have to do around home and family issues before you can move on and bring some more motivation eventually, after the whole thing is said and done, into your creative life.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Yeah, well, I think you did a great job of covering, this idea, this internal process, and the jump it makes from Cancer to Leo. So I think just trying to see if there's anything else I wanted to add to it is, yeah, there really is that feeling of, look, I kind of think you already said this, but just like moving forwards in some area and then kind of hitting a snag and having to really go back and understand the deeper layers of your motivation and your emotional issues that might be popping up in your family life. I mean, I really think that that's what we're focusing on. And then once you kind of go through that and it stations direct again and it starts moving forwards, it's sort of this reassembly process and this new strategy, and maybe this new strategy of how you handle your emotions in your family life, of how you choose to work with that. And you might have been doing it one way for a long time, and as it stations direct, you really have this opportunity to do it differently and to connect with your family and your home life in a new way, that will be much more clear, and you'll have cleared out some debris and some frustration and confusion about what you want. And then once it crosses that sign line again back into Leo, you really will be cooking. You'll be able to really start, you'll be able to express your love in a more clear way where you've done this personal work. You'll be able to really pour your energy and yourself into your creative work. If you're an artist or anybody who's creating anything that you really enjoy doing, there's going to be a real move forwards in that area once it goes direct. So it's, even though there's work, there's challenge, there might be some frustration, ultimately on the other side of this process, there's going to be a new you.
A new you. I like that. Okay, we're going to move now to folks who have Taurus rising.
Okay, so those of you who have Taurus rising, this Mars retrograde is happening in your fourth and your third house. So the fourth house refers to home and family life. And it's very possible that, you might feel like you are moving on forwards into something to do with your home life. You're feeling good about it. You're like, okay, good. We're just going to charge forwards and everything's going to be good. However, once you hit that retrograde, and once Mars retrogrades, you're going to come to find out that there's actually something that isn't quite right, that isn't quite in alignment. There's some way that your personal expression, your personal self-expression is going to be coming at odds with some other part of your life, and you're just going to find yourself having to do some soul searching and having to do a deeper look at what is motivating you, what is motivating your actions in your family life. And then, Mars is going to retrograde back into Cancer, and it's going to take that into the emotional layer. You're going to have to really look at, how are you communicating? Why are you communicating? What are you trying to share? And bear in mind the third house can be your siblings. So there might be something to do with some frustration or intensity around siblings. It has to do with neighbors, your local environment. So there's something to do with the way you relate to your immediate neighbors that might come in under review. And it's just the way you communicate in general. And if you're coming from a really emotionally reactive place and you're somewhat lacking in some self-understanding, that's going to become readily obvious during this retrograde period. And there's going to be some, like, oh, I don't know, maybe some situations that you're like, ooh, I shouldn't have said that. But that's a little bit about this process. Yeah, what do you have to add, Laurie?
I don't really have anything to add. I think you covered everything. I mean, I can talk about it more, but it's really just what you said. How are you expressing yourself? How do you think the forward movement in your home and family is going to go, and facing the reality that you've hit a wall and you have to go back, not only thinking about the motivation for how you express yourself in your home and family, but then into these deeper levels of how you communicate with some of those people or other people in your environment. But there's a lot of internal work that has to be done before you can buy that new house or you know, whatever, move your parents into the mother-in-law apartment or whatever it is, that home and family area. It could really show up on a really practical level of your home or your family. So at any rate, that's pretty much covers it, I think, Taurus rising. So now we're going to talk about folks who have Gemini rising. Now, Gemini rising, I know both you and I have important people in our life that have this rising sign that we always think about when we get to Gemini rising. So, for people with Gemini rising, this Mars retrograde starts out in the third house. There's some way in which you probably are feeling like all systems are go. You know how to communicate with whoever you need to communicate with. That could involve siblings, neighborhood. There may be some activity, some way in which you feel really motivated to express yourself in your communications. And as you're, excitedly moving toward that process, you hit some sort of a wall. There's some way in which your communications are not received the way you expected them to be, and you have to kind of backtrack and really think about, what were your motivations in that area? What was driving you forward? And that brings you back into Cancer, into the second house, where it's really going to hit this very emotional place of your self-worth. Are you, really questioning your own emotional ability to communicate? There's some real emotional work that you have to do before you can bring this self-expression into your communication.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes me think too, like some of the things that might come into play where, I mean, the third house is certainly how you use your voice, so like what are you speaking about? How are you using your voice in your
Ah,
life?
interesting.
Yeah, and and then like the second house, I mean, I think you've already mentioned this, but like taking it back to, okay, maybe there's some complications around money or attachments to something's supposed to be valued a certain way, and then you're coming to find out that it's not, or you're not being valued in the way that you think that you should be. There's some process about that, and then having to go in and ask questions like, well, how am I valuing myself? Like how am I holding myself in high self-esteem? What emotional factors might be holding me back from, really completing this emotional work that I've left behind. There's something about that. I certainly can think about personal ways this might be playing out. But things in my life. But also like so some keywords. I thought some key ideas for how to handle this time is, just pay attention to feelings of frustration, pay attention to feelings of burnout. Notice, especially with that third house thing here, notice maybe a temptation to communicate somewhat passive aggressively, like not really saying what you mean. And you might not even know you're doing it, which is part of why the retrograde is going to take you back into some other things. And then as it stations direct and you start moving forwards, that's a really good time to set some new and different conscious goals, but goals about your consciousness, not external goals like I'm trying to, hit this, milestone, but internal goals around how you take care of yourself, how you relieve stress, are you getting enough alone time? Those kinds of questions are going to be really important to your self-esteem and how you communicate. So, yeah.
That's great. Okay, I think we've covered that, and let's move on to Cancer rising.
Ah, so personal.
So personal.
All right. So those of you with Cancer rising, this is very personal to you. I mean, this Mars retrograde is personal anyway because it's in Cancer and it's in Leo, which are the two signs, as we've mentioned, associated with your sun and your moon, no matter where your sun and your moon are. So for those of you with Cancer rising, well, guess what? Your moon is in charge of your entire chart. So to have Mars retrograding back into your first house where Cancer is really a big time of considering how you want to direct your energy, considering that tricky balance of like, are you caring for yourself enough? Are you, as you move through the world, or are you being, too selfish, and kind of looking at that balance. That's what some of the the factors that might come into play. Let me back up a little bit. What's going to happen is Mars has been in Cancer. It goes into Leo, and you feel like, oh yeah, I've got this, and things are moving forwards, and everything's cool, and off we go. And then you kind of hit that place where it's like, oh, and Mars retrogrades, and it is really going to require looking at your financial thing, looking at how do you want to handle your finances. The way you earn money is at stake here. That's something you really want to look at. And with Mars retrograding, you're going to have to really dig in and come to some self-understanding about what is important to you. How do you want to earn money? What are you doing about your livelihood that's working for you and what isn't? And then once it backs all the way into Cancer and goes back into your first house, it's going to really go into this deep question around how you handle your emotional resources and how you handle your emotional reactivity. Certainly can think about that one a little bit.
Yeah.
Since this one's mine. But it really is going to take you back into that. And it might be very difficult. It might be painful. It might be dismaying to be like, oh, I thought I'd kind of checked the box on that one. And no, you haven't. It's going to take another look for you to really kind of come to some kind of understanding. So I feel like I'm talking a lot, so I'm going to kick the ball back over to you.
Well, the thing that I want to add to that and is that with Cancer rising and Mars moving back in there to Cancer, this is going to be even more powerful for folks who have their personal moon in Scorpio or Aries.
Hmm.
And I think I know someone who that might be. So it's going to really, bring up the emotions on an even more powerful or deeper level. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's definitely personal, and it's definitely about money and how you understand yourself as a person who can create resources and a person who can really build on their self-worth. We all have those connections between self-worth and finances. And this is really going to bring those things up. And whoever you are, if you've got Cancer rising, look at where the moon is in your chart, and that'll give you more information.
Yeah. I was thinking that's such an important piece to this whole retrograde business is looking at your own moon and sun. And I just want to add just real quick here, a couple tools in the toolbox for handling this time period are really watching for burnout, making sure you get enough rest, watching out for passive aggressive behavior, where you're kind of projecting your stuff onto other people. Just be really mindful of those things. And then once it stations and you're kind of moving, things start moving forwards again, you really will have an opportunity to come up with a new set of conscious goals for how you operate on a personal level. So I think those will be helpful things to think about.
And another thing, don't initiate anything big,
Oh yeah.
you know?
Do the stuff you've
Especially
already been working on. And I know exactly what that is for me. So
yeah, it's like
very much.
while Mars is retrograde in your second house, don't decide you're going to suddenly initiate some new big way of making money. That's not the way to go.
Yeah.
Okay, so are we ready to move on?
Yes.
We got you there, Jenny. Okay, we're going to move on now to folks who have Leo rising. And here again, this is very personal. This Mars retrograde is going to begin in your first house. So, Mars was moving through Cancer. You were doing all your internal, looking at your psychological or opening up some spiritual things within yourself. And then Mars moves into the first house and it's like, phew, I can really express myself. Here I am. I'm in a place where I feel very motivated to express myself with all this drama and brightness of Leo. And then Mars stations and you hit a wall. It's like, oh, I can't do it that way. The thing to understand with Mars retrograde is this, whatever this represents to you is a long-term process. It's not something that you can get done in a short amount of time. So if you have Leo rising, one of the storylines here is how you express yourself. And you're not going to be able to suddenly create that expression that you envision in your mind. You've got to really look at what motivates you. What is it that's motivating you for that self-expression? And then when Mars dips back into the 12th house, into Cancer, you're going to really be looking at the emotional work that you haven't wrapped up yet. The deep, deep internal psychological understanding of yourself that you have to develop and work on before you can go into this more self-expressive place. Yeah, it's very personal, and there's a lot of real internal work to do. What about you, Jenny? What do you see there?
Well, I can't help it. This is one of those ones where, not only are you crossing into a different house, but you're crossing into a different hemisphere on this chart. So, you're really, and not only are you crossing a different hemisphere, it's the horizon line. So we're talking about everything below the horizon line, from the Leo rising over to Aquarius, everything below that is things you have to really work on your own personal level. And so here you have Leo in the first house, and yes, it's all about how you show up, how you radiate your personality, how you walk through the world as this like Leo person, that you're a flame and moths are drawn to the flame, like you are this light. And then it's like you're having to go back into the 12th house, which is very much about how you, I don't know, like receive the collective, like how you kind of handle, like you can see all that and how you work with it on this personal level and where it intersects with your inner psychology. So, really this is so representative of just being like, oh man, oh, I got to go back and do that therapeutic work. I thought I did it. I thought I was done, and I'm just over it. And like, you're not over it. Hey, you just have to go back, and it's going to be for the best. It's going to allow you to really clear out some, frustration, some confusion. It's not an easy process. We've talked about this as a long process. But it really is going to allow you. I kind of think you got to go shovel out the shit. You got to take the shovel and, you just got to do it. And it's going to open up something really much more expansive in you. And you're going to be able to step into that Leo role, especially as Mars remains in Leo through that period. You're really going to be able to step into that leadership role where you will be a light for other people. But because you've done this background work, you'll be able to show up in a much more authentic way for you. So I think it's going to be challenging, but also really going to lift you to a new level. So yeah, and just do your self-care stuff. You're going to need a lot of self-care support in this time. Like so. Be alone when you need to, socialize when you need to, talk to the people that are going to help you through, that'll really support you.
Awesome. Wonderful. Okay, let's move on to folks who have Virgo rising.
Okay, all right. So what is this one all about, Lori?
Uh, I'll let you talk about it.
So if you have Virgo rising, this whole Mars retrograde business is happening between your 12th and your 11th house. So the way this kind of plays out is, when Mars is in Cancer, it's cruising through your 11th house. So it's really kind of, lighting up your social groups, your community that the 11th house brings for you. It's been lighting up your ability to receive support, your ability to let the people around you help you with whatever's going on for you. That's kind of the first part. And then it moves into Leo, and you're like, okay, good, I've got this. I've got this. I'm gonna heal. I'm gonna, handle my subconscious stuff. It's gonna be just fine and everything's great. And then, it retrogrades, so then you're really, going to be asked to look at, okay, you're going to have to kind of clear out and get down to the bottom of what motivates your behavior, what motivates your self-expression, what motivates the way that you are operating in your world as a through the kind of more fiery parts of your personality. And then it's going to go all the way back into Cancer, and that's going to really take a look at, all right, what about emotional reactivity in dealing with group situations? Are you able to truly receive the support of your community? Because that's really what the 11th house represents. It allows you to be held up by your social groups, your social circles, to really support you in all of the endeavors that you're doing. So it's sort of suggesting that there's something that's impeding you there. There's some inability to just accept those gifts, to accept that support. And this Mars retrograde is really going to give you an opportunity to suss that out and release some old behaviors and habits that are blocking you, so that when it then reverses direction and stations direct and moves back forward, there's going to be this process of things kind of coming back into play and falling into place and allowing you to express yourself more clearly. So yeah, interesting. What do you have to say?
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting. And I'm not quite sure what to say, but it certainly feels relevant to me personally. That whole, with this surgery and stuff, having to lean on people in ways that do not are not easy for me.
Yeah.
Having to ask for help, having to allow myself to be supported is really, really challenging. And yeah, going into Leo, it's like, oh, phew, I don't need to ask for that anymore. I can just plow forward and do whatever inner work I think I'm doing in order to express myself. Yeah, really hitting that wall and understanding that wherever Cancer is in our charts, there is deep, deep, old emotional issues that really, this gives us an opportunity to unpack in a new way.
Mm.
And, we never come to the end of these things. I had a client once say to me, when is it gonna, when's it gonna get all better? It's like, well, not in this lifetime. We just keep doing these cycles and learning these things over and over and over again. And if you have Virgo rising, that issue of support from community is always going to be a place where you have deep emotional work to be done. And this Mars retrograde is giving you an opportunity to do it. So
Yeah. I think in a
it's,
nutshell, isn't this really just speaking about our internal battles, between how we express ourselves and then what's our inner emotional world? I mean, that's really what the Mars retrograde is going to dredge up.
yeah,
And for those
yeah.
of you with Virgo rising, it's this process that takes place in the public sphere, more obviously than
I
it's.
love that you just said that. We could have saved the whole last hour and a half of this video and just said that at the beginning.
I know, it just came to me. Oh well. Lucky you, Virgo rising.
Oh
Okay.
dear. Okay, let's move on to folks who have Libra rising. So if you've got Libra rising, this tells us that the Mars retrograde is going to start its process well, it's going to start the actual retrograde itself in your 11th house in Leo. So, you can think about the period of time approaching this retrograde as Mars was moving through Cancer, moving through your 10th house. There's a lot of energy being put out into your career, your social reputation. You're moving along. Mars moves into Leo, and this is really all about you wanting to express yourself in a large way, in community, within the space of community. You want to really express yourself. So, okay, that's all happening. But then you hit a wall. The retrograde, puts you in a position where you're hitting a wall where you have to really ask yourself, what is motivating me? What is my motivation for this self-expression and community? Um, so there's that contemplation that's going on, and you want to really be careful here because initiating situations, initiating community situations is going to backfire on you. So you want to make sure you're not initiating anything in that area. You're really just paying attention to questioning your own motivation here.
Mm.
And then as it moves back into Cancer, you are really having to look at deep emotional work around how you show up in your career, in your social reputation. What are the deep emotional components? What's the deep emotional work that you have to go back and dig into before you are ready to move into a more self-expressed area of community.
Mhm.
So what are you going to add to that?
Well, it's interesting to me, kind of on the tail end of what you just said, just how, as a Libra rising person, you go to work with your emotions on your sleeve. Like your emotional well-being and your emotional desires and your emotional motivation are so tightly tied to your work. And so it's time to understand that attachment. It's time for you to dig in and understand your emotional attachments to your work and how much of yourself you're bringing. And it might be that part of the work here is around setting some different boundaries. If you're really struggling with burnout, or you've notoriously struggled with burnout over the years, this is an opportunity to get to a deeper layer of that, so that that doesn't happen as much. And I think that's the helpfulness about this retrograde is, yes, you're having to go back and deal with these frustrations and this, oh, I thought I already did this and I don't want to do this again, but if knowledge is power, so knowing that this is the process and going, okay, I have to do this. Ultimately, what it's going to do is it's going to serve you a lot better. So once Mars then resumes its forward motion, once it hits that point, and we're in late February, you will start to see some of the fruits of your labors, like, oh, okay, like now I can relate to this better and not get so burned out. Now I can relate to this better and be, protect myself and make sure I'm getting enough self-care in conjunction with my work, because I see a potential for burnout. And then once it really moves back into Leo and you're everything's all systems go, I think there's a real joy that can happen in your social world, where
Mm,
you can really sort of celebrate this difficult, gate that you've had to pass
mm,
through.
I like
Because
that.
at the end of the day, we're dealing with an internal battle here.
Mm,
This internal battle. We're all having to look at our emotions and how they work with how we express ourselves. So consider what that is for you, and then use these tools. So,
mm,
yeah.
awesome. Okay, we're going to move on then to folks who have Scorpio rising.
Okay. Oh yeah, this is me. Like, I'm done. I just talked a lot. Okay. We with those of you who have Scorpio rising, this Mars retrograde period is happening in a very public place for you. It's happening in your 10th and your ninth house. So the 10th house is the most public house. So for a lot of us, that's our profession. That's where we spend the chunk of our daylight hours out in this public setting. It might also just be how you show up in public, your public behavior, even if you're a stay-at-home parent, well, is a public thing to being a stay-at-home parent. So no matter what, that's where this is taking place. And it's going back into your ninth house, which is a source of wisdom, a source of higher learning. The ninth house can be teachers. And really, it's about your whole worldly philosophy. So that's where the Mars retrograde is taking place. And it's going to play out something like, at first, as Mars has been in Cancer, there's been a lot of learning. There's been a lot of learning about your emotional attachments to your philosophy. You sort of feel like, okay, I'm a Scorpio rising person. I think I kind of know who I am as an emotional person, and I'm good, and I got this, and here we go. And then Mars moves into Leo and starts really lighting up your 10th house, like a lot of motivation and energy at work, like things really moving forwards. However, then we hit the retrograde period. It starts on December 6th. So at that point, there's going to be this kind of maybe even a shock of like, oh, I thought we were all systems go on this work project. And, what the heck? Like, I should be good. The holidays are here. Like, I was expecting this to be done. And it's not. So at that point, you really may find yourself digging in to understand, like, why am I so motivated by this project? What does it matter to me in this, very public sphere? Like, what is the issue? And really looking at, you may have some ego attachments to whatever's happening. And that's one way to think about the sun, because it rules Leo. And so Mars being in Leo, it's like that, really causing you to think deeply about how you express yourself. And then it's going to backtrack all the way into Cancer, which is going to bring up this real like, wow, I guess I thought I was all good with this, my life philosophy and my worldview. And I thought I was open-minded and I thought I was doing it. And I'm coming to find out that there's some baggage in there and there's some cleaning out that very likely will have to happen during that time period. But it's all for your higher education. It's all for your the real depth of your understanding and your vision and your wisdom. So that's some of it.
Yeah. The only thing I was thinking too is that you may have, enter with Mars going into Leo, the 10th house. Yeah, you're very motivated to express yourself in your work or your social reputation, whatever that is for you. But this could be, as it hits that wall of the retrograde and goes back into the ninth house, you might really realize that you need some education that you don't have for the kind of expression you thought you were going to be able to just automatically go into. You might realize that you need more education or you need a broader view of the culture itself or a broader view of, yeah, of the world. There's some way in which your worldview, there's such an emotional component that it may just be too small for you to express yourself the way you need to.
Mhm.
So maybe you need to go back to school or start mentoring with Jennie or I.
Yeah, yeah. Now, I always want to add one more thing to that, which is don't make the mistake of thinking that you need to come up with a bunch of new work goals. It's not that you need to come up with work goals. It's that you need to deal with the internal struggle between your philosophy and your worldview and then what's happening at work. It's more like once you go through that process, the goals will become apparent.
Right.
So I
Right.
just want to make that
And
clear.
yeah, and you don't want to be initiating anything.
Yeah.
Also, it's not a time for initiation. It's a time for the inner work. Exactly. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to move now to folks who have Sagittarius rising. If you have Sagittarius rising, this Mars retrograde is happening between your eighth house and your ninth house. Before the retrograde occurred, Mars was going through, going around doing its thing. It went through your eighth house, really energizing bringing a lot of energy to your emotional understanding of how to navigate um, places where you share resources with others or places where you need to set boundaries for yourself. There's some ways that, you were kind of moving through that area. And then Mars goes into Leo. Mars really likes being in Leo. And it's like, oh, okay, all systems go. We're going to, kind of maybe travel, maybe get some more education, maybe just expand and heat up our understanding of our worldview. And then you hit a wall, and it's like, wait a minute, I'm not quite sure that I am as clear on what my worldview is as I thought I was. And there's some way in which your self-expression, with Leo in that ninth house, you really express yourself through your worldview. It's kind of an automatic place where you express yourself and where you learn about yourself. And with Mars going in there and then hitting that wall of the retrograde, it's like you're questioning it. What is it? What is my motivation? Why am I so motivated to express myself through my worldview when maybe I'm not as clear about it as I thought I was? So, this is a time to really settle in and give some time to your understanding. And then as Mars backtracks and goes back into Cancer, it goes into really the emotional work that you have to do on yourself before you can bring that renewed self-expression into your worldview. So there's some deep emotional work connected with how you share resources with others, how you navigate other people's deepest issues, how you set boundaries to support yourself. There's some deep, deep inner work. You don't want to initiate anything around these things at this time. You don't want to all of a sudden say, oh, yeah, I've got to set new boundaries. No, you just want to go in and do your own inner work of understanding what that deep emotional component is and doing that work.
Yeah, I know the more we've been running through these with the Mars retrograde thing, I just keep on thinking about this is an internal battle, So in other words, this is a conflict between the way that you express yourself outwardly, and in this case through your world philosophy, and then your inward handling of your own emotional stuff up against other people's emotional stuff. So there's a real it's about that internal battle. It may manifest as battles with people outside of you, especially in the eighth house. But all of those people, it's almost like you can just think about any intense conflicts that you come up against in the next few months. Those people are your teachers. You might not like them. You might feel really angry, but you are learning something about them, and you're learning something about yourself that is going to give you, an unshakable emotional foundation with yourself. And so that's really what you want to work with. The thing that came to mind for me too is there's going to be a renegotiation after this retrograde for you of all of your contracts with other people, all of those kind of intimate things. But the renegotiation is going to come about, I think, more naturally after you go through the process. It's not during the process, it's after. You've kind of gone through it, you've had this understanding of yourself, and then there's this window for this renegotiation. And at the end of it, I think that your relationships could be much more satisfying and more balanced,
Yeah.
so, and your relationship to yourself,
It's
especially.
really interesting. I'm thinking about a particular situation with this. And when you said something about anger with other people's deep stuff, I think there's also, also think about where you have like really powerful concerns for others,
Mm.
not just anger. I think there's also, you know, you might be really encountering powerful concerns and you want to really navigate your um yeah, your boundaries in very careful ways with Cancer in that area.
Yeah,
Anyway.
no, that's a good point. It's kind of like that projection principle. Make sure you're not projecting your own
Yeah.
stuff. Is it you kind of mean like that a little bit?
Yeah. Yeah, it's this is an interesting one. And I think we're done with it. Okay, so we're going to
Yeah.
move on to people with Capricorn rising.
Okay, so those of you with Capricorn rising, this Mars retrograde process is happening between your eighth and your seventh houses. Taken together, the seventh and the eighth houses very much have to do with your relationships. The seventh house is where you encounter that partner, that sort of balanced place of like, this sort of, yeah, just a balanced place. And then you hit the eighth house in relationships, and suddenly you're into each other's stuff, and that's when you start often having conflicts. But if you take the seventh and the eighth house together, that's how you really have a deep, solid connection where you manage each other's boundaries okay. You have a good level of intimacy. And from the outside, because these are both public houses, you appear to have this like rock solid partnership. Like that's what the two together kind of look like. But during this Mars retrograde period, it's like, first of all, Mars has moved through your seventh house, and you're probably feeling quite a bit of energy in the partner house. You're like, yep, I'm pretty good here. I've done the work. I'm handled my emotional reactivity, blah, blah, blah. I'm done. Good. And then Mars moves into Leo, and it continues charging through and kind of affirms, like, yep, you're doing all the right things. You're handling the way you handle your ego up against your, your different partners in life. And it seems like all systems are go. And then Mars retrogrades. And in that Mars retrograde process, you really are going to be having to look at the deeper layers of how you handle any sort of partnership. And yes, this can be spouse and marriage, but it's also business partners, and it's really any one-on-one relationship that you encounter that has any sort of public component to it. So, that is what you're going to have to be looking at. And as Mars retrogrades through your eighth house, you're going to have to be looking at, the deeper layers of like How are you setting boundaries? How are you expressing your own desires? And then once it kind of creeps back into that seventh house, and is back in Cancer, you're going to have to look again at some of the emotional layers that have to do with the way you handle your partnerships. And it's intense work. This is not easy work. This is a long process, and it could be really frustrating because you could be feeling, oh, I'm doing great, and then you hit this place where you're like, damn, I'm not doing great. Like, I thought I did this and I thought I was done with this and I'm so over it. And you're just gonna have to take a deep breath. And work with it, work with the material, because it's going to really empower you in the long run. So yeah.
Yeah, I think this is a very intense one, having those two houses involved in this retrograde. And I was just thinking as you were talking about Mars in Leo in the eighth house and really questioning, how is your ego attached to these, to your ability to set boundaries, to your ability to navigate other people's stuff? How is your ego attached to that? And how does that kind of make space for you be to do the emotional work of the seventh house? There's something really tricky, I think, in this, um, for those of you that have Capricorn rising, because as Capricorn rising person, you show up in the room as the authority. You are the authority. And all of a sudden you're having to question, how is my ego attached to how I navigate other people's stuff? And what levels of really, really emotional work do I have to navigate with my partner or a partner? There's some very, very deep work in here. And, I feel like listening to what you said and now what I'm saying, it's like, oh, this sounds so depressing. So I do want to say that, the result of this work is what you're looking for, because ultimately you do that deep inner work. You look at your own ego attachment to your abilities around navigating other people's stuff. And you clear the decks here a little bit.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
just, one thing that occurs to me again, I didn't really say, was just that the tricky part here is that it'd be really easy just to blame your partner or your partners in life, be like, oh, it's your fault. You're this, you're that. And this particular process really is inviting you to look at the internal levels, your part to play in relationships, how you show up as a partner. So just, be mindful of that, and take the time you need. And you may need to take a lot more solo time than you usually do, to work through this. But you're right. Like it does sound a little like, oh God. But yeah, on the other side of this, you are just going to be so much better equipped to handle your partnerships, and you're going to be so much more able to have strategies for handling stress, to be diplomatic in a positive and healthy way.
Yeah. I love it. That's very great. Okay, we are going to move then on to folks who have Aquarius rising. If you've got Aquarius rising, this retrograde is happening right on the fault line between above the horizon and below the horizon. So before the retrograde happened, Mars was, happily going through Cancer, going through your sixth house. You may have been really doing some work on finding new ways to manage your day-to-day routines, taking action around caring for yourself in that way. And then Mars moved into Leo, into your seventh house. And there's really this sense of being really motivated to express yourself in partnership. And then we hit a wall. And the expression in partnership suddenly just isn't feeling the way you wanted or anticipated it to feel. And Mars is really asking you to slow down and think about what is your motivation for showing up in this bright, shiny, dramatic way that Leo wants to show up in relationship. What's your motivation for that? And really giving some consideration to that, slowing down as Mars re-enters Cancer, you're going to go into a very emotional place of trying to really understand the emotional work that's involved in your day-to-day routines. It's not just about, oh, I go running every morning at 6 a.m. or oh, I meditate at 6:15 a.m. or oh, I go to the gym 3 times a week or I'm a vegetarian. It's not, for those of you with Aquarius rising, these day-to-day routines that make up your lifestyle are a place of extreme sensitivity and emotion. Um, this Mars going retrograde back into Cancer is really inviting you to do some work to really understand what underlies your emotional needs in that area. And once you can really work with that, the self-expression into the seventh house is going to feel more authentic. You're going to really be able to um, come back into your relationships with more glitz,
Mm.
glitz and glamour.
Yeah. Yeah, this one is like you said, the fault line you said at the beginning, because the whole upper half of the chart really is where you're starting to move out into the social realm, the more public realm, and the bottom half is the more individualized and the personal realm. And so it is interesting. I think the key word that comes to mind for me for this one is that, you're moving forward, just as you said, Laurie, into this relationship, and then all of a sudden you might have to withdraw. And so that word withdraw came to mind, like this idea that it is not that you're leaving the relationship. I mean, that could certainly be some manifestation, but I would certainly advise do not rush into anything. Do not rush into making a giant change. I mean, certainly things that you're not passionate about will fall away, during this process. But that's not the key focus. The key focus is that you may need to withdraw back into yourself to have a greater understanding of how you want to show up to this partnership. And it might be that you have a tendency to give away too much. And so you've stepped away from your self-care routines that you really need. And this Mars retrograde period will give you a chance to really look at that and not, really work with that idea of not losing yourself in the relationship, but really anchoring and grounding yourself in your own emotional routines that you really need. Like this is real vital self-care. This is really how do you practice every day in this self-care mode so that when you do or when Mars does go direct, you really will be able to step into this relationship in a newly authentic kind of way where you're not going to give up too much of yourself. That you're going to be able to offer what you can and not overdo it. And that's really the key is this, working with this internal battle that you may experience and kind of coming out the other end of that and moving into a relationship that's got more diplomacy to it, that is more balanced, and that is more joyful. So, yeah.
Awesome. Wonderful. Okay, we're going to move on to folks who have Pisces rising.
All right. So, those of you with Pisces rising, let's see, this Mars retrograde is going to be occurring in your fifth and your sixth houses. Those are two interesting houses because when you look at them together, it's the fifth has a lot to say about creative process, like, ooh, I love to do this thing, I love to skydive, so I'm going to make sure I do that. Or I love to paint big pictures, so I'm doing that and I'm doing my painting. And then the sixth house starts to say, okay, well, how do you routinize that? How do you make that into a practice, something that you do on the daily, like these creative pursuits? So the two of them together often have something to say about how you bring your creative self into your daily work. And so having Mars retrograde here is going to give you a chance to kind of suss that out. And at first, with Mars in the fifth house in Cancer, things are moving forwards. You're like, yep, I've got my thing. I'm doing my creative self. I'm, building on my relationship with my children. I'm emotionally available because the fifth house can be children. I'm doing all the things. I'm good. Okay. And then Mars moving into the sixth house of like, yep, got my routines. I'm good. I'm taking action the way I need to. And then the retrograde happens. And suddenly you are met with kind of a shock, like, wait a minute, I don't know if these practices are serving me anymore. I don't know why I'm doing this. I don't know what's motivating my self-expression here. So that those are some of the questions that might start to appear, I know, and then Mars is going to continue its retrograde motion and go back into Cancer and go back into your fifth house, and you're going to find yourself really having to dig into the deeper emotional layers of the way you give of yourself. And again, like if you have children, this certainly could be a process that is very much tied to them. Like, how do you give of yourself as a parent, yet still maintain some self-expression for yourself, like where you're not just completely, losing yourself in that relationship. I mean, sometimes you have to, but so those are some of the topics that may be coming up for you during this Mars retrograde. And what's worthwhile is really to allow yourself the time for some self-understanding, allow yourself the time to sort of penetrate beyond the shallow layers and get to an understanding of what motivates you and what makes you feel emotionally reactive. So, yeah.
That's great. I was just thinking about, that motivation. What is it that's motivating you to create this shiny lifestyle? What is it that's motivating you to go to the gym every day or to meditate every day? And really thinking about what that motivation is. Um, and then that it's so interesting because that fifth house we think of, it's such a playful, wonderful house. We think about children and love affairs and creativity. With Pisces rising, you have Cancer in there, so it's such a sensitive area. It is so incredibly sensitive. And during this retrograde, you really do need to go into the emotional work of it. If you're some sort of an artist or a mom, whatever it is, or a dad, the children or the creativity, your emotions are so tied into that role as a parent or that role as an artist or that role as a lover. Your emotions are so tied in there. And there's emotional work that you're going to really need to do that's going to allow you ultimately to really see what your motivations are in creating the lifestyle that you imagine and want to create.
Mhm. Yeah, it's an important time to think about stress relief with this one too. Like make sure that's what that kind of self-care thing is, I think, is make sure you're managing stress when you notice you're feeling reactive. Like do the things that support you in releasing stress. Take the solo time that you need to
Right.
take.
Yeah.
Notice, watch out for burnout. Those are kind of some of the cues.
And
So,
don't initiate some new big exercise program. Don't initiate anything during this time. Just, yeah, yeah, pay attention and self-care is important. Okay, Jenny, I think we're done.
yeah.
I think we did it. Okay. Well, thank you, Jenny, and thank you for anyone who's still watching us.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you,
Bye.
Lori. Thanks.